The Grand Hall of the Galactic Assembly stood as a monument to 1,000 civilizations working in harmony across the stars. And on this particular day, it held representatives from 347 different species who had gathered to conduct their regular business of maintaining peace and prosperity throughout known Space Chief Delegate Sarah. Chen of Humanity stood at the central podium with a simple data tablet in her hands, while the assembled aliens watched with varying degrees of interest and boredom, depending on their species. Particular way of experiencing emotion, or its equivalent, the United Earth Government, hereby formally withdraws from the Galactic Assembly, effective immediately, Sarah said in a clear voice that the translation systems carried to every being in the chamber. We thank you for 200 years of cooperation and wish you well in your future endeavors. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, before the Virethal high speaker, a being that looked like flowing mercury, given shape and purpose, made a sound that translated as confused amusement. This is unexpected. The Virethal said with its voice resonating through quantum vibrations, though perhaps not entirely surprising given humanity's peculiar nature, the Mechanor Collective's representative, a crystalline intelligence that existed across 17 linked nodes, chimed in with what passed for agreement among its kind. Humanity has always been unusually concerned with unlikely scenarios and redundant preparations. It observed perhaps they have calculated some danger the rest of us have missed. Several species made sounds that the translators rendered as polite laughter. Sarah maintained her diplomatic composure even as she felt irritation rising in her chest. Our reasons are our own, she replied. The withdrawal is final and non-negotiable. Within the hour, humanity's delegation had packed their materials and departed Concordia Station. And within the day, every human ship received the same order through quantum-entangled communications. That couldn't be intercepted or delayed. Return home immediately, Captain James Rodriguez commanded. The cargo vessel Persistent Fortune, and he read the withdrawal order 3 times before believing it. All hands prepare for immediate departure. He announced to his crew, "We're going home. What about the Solon shipment we were supposed to pick up?" His first officer asked, with confusion evident in her voice. "Leave it," James said firmly. "Orders are orders, and these ones don't leave room for interpretation." Across the galaxy, the same scene repeated itself thousands of times as human vessels, large and small, broke their contracts and began the journey back to human space. And while some species complained about the inconvenience, most simply shrugged their equivalent of shoulders and moved on with their business on. The massive trade station Epsilon Convergence, a Thrall merchant watched the last human freighter depart and clicked his mandibles in mild annoyance. Unreliable as always. He muttered, "No matter, the automated systems will handle the transport schedules." What the Thrall didn't know was that the human logistics coordinator had been manually adjusting those automated systems for 5 years to account for a subtle drift in the station's atomic clocks that the Thrall's own engineers insisted was within acceptable parameters. Engineer Marcus Webb supervised the evacuation of human personnel from the hyperspace relay station Game 7, which was one of the critical nodes that allowed faster-than-light communication across a 50-light-year radius. "Did you leave the maintenance logs?" asked his assistant technician. "Left everything exactly as the assembly specification requires." Marcus confirmed, "though I doubt they'll read them. Should we tell them about the capacitor issue?" The assistant pressed. Marcus had spent 6 months trying to convince the station's Mechanor administrators that 3 specific capacitors needed replacement, even though they were still operating at 94% efficiency, and the Mechanor insisted that placement before 80% efficiency was wasteful and illogical. "I filed 17 reports," Marcus said tiredly. "They're all in the system if anyone bothers to look, and that's all our contract required." On the peaceful world of Harmony's Rest, where the empathic Solon maintained their cultural centers, a human counselor named David Park said his goodbyes to colleagues he'd worked alongside for a decade. "I don't understand why you're leaving," his Solon counterpart said with genuine distress, coloring her emotional projection. "We work so well together, it's complicated." David replied honestly, "But I can tell you that the backup emotional dampening system I installed in the Western facility should be checked monthly, even though I know you believe the primary system is perfect." The Solon touched his hand gently. "You humans and your obsession with backup systems," she said with affectionate exasperation. "We will miss your strange, cautious ways." 3 weeks after the last human crossed back into human space, the borders sealed completely, and every human station along the frontier activated defensive grids. That had been quietly upgraded over the past decade, and when assembly ships approached requesting explanation, they received only a recorded message informing them that human space was now closed to all foreign vessels indefinitely. The Galactic Assembly Council met to discuss this unprecedented situation, and the consensus was that humanity had always been odd. Contributors to galactic civilization with their constant worry about disaster scenarios and their insistence on maintaining what they called safety margins in every system. "Good riddance," declared a counselor from the Praetorian Compact. "Perhaps now we can optimize our operations without their constant objections to our efficiency improvements." What none of them realized was that in the 6 weeks since humanity's withdrawal, 17 critical infrastructure systems had already begun showing the first signs of degradation, and the only people who would have noticed were no longer watching the monitoring stations in a quiet agricultural world called New Providence. Farmer felt a brief flicker in his home's power grid and frowned, because the power had been perfectly stable for 70 years, and this was the first interruption he'd ever experienced, but he shrugged and returned to his work assuming it was a momentary glitch in Concordia Station itself. The hyperspace relay network experienced a 0.003-second delay in processing a routine communication, and the automated systems logged it as within normal parameters and moved in the deep quantum data cores that stored the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 civilizations, a single bit of information corrupted, and the error correction systems caught it immediately, but didn't catch the fact that the error correction systems themselves were now operating without the redundant checking protocols that a human engineer had quietly added to them 40 years earlier. The galaxy continued turning, and business continued as usual, and everyone agreed that they'd made the right decision in letting humanity go their own way, because really what had those anxious, paranoid little creatures contributed anyway? Besides needless worry and wasteful redundancy, in 3 months, they would begin to find out. 6 months had passed since humanity sealed its borders, and the Galactic Assembly was facing a crisis that none of their sophisticated predictive algorithms had foreseen, because the algorithms themselves were part of the problem. The first major catastrophe struck the hyperspace relay network when Relay Station Game 7 experienced a complete cascade failure that disrupted faster-than-light communications across an entire sector and left 40 billion beings unable to contact anyone beyond their local star systems. Engineer First Class Torvin of the Mechanar Collective arrived at the station with a team of the galaxy's finest technical minds, and they spent 3 days analyzing the failure before Torvin made a discovery that chilled his crystalline matrix to its core. The capacitors failed. He reported to the Emergency Council. 3 primary capacitors operating at 93% efficiency experienced simultaneous catastrophic breakdown that should be impossible. His supervisor stated with absolute certainty components don't fail while still operating within acceptable parameters. Torvin pulled up the maintenance logs and found 17 reports filed by someone named Marcus Webb, documenting an unusual degradation pattern and recommending early replacement, but every report had been automatically rejected by the system because replacement before 80% efficiency violated standard optimization protocols. "Who is Marcus Webb?" Torvin asked. His supervisor corrected he was the human engineer stationed here, and he left when humanity withdrew. The realization spread through the Mechanor collective like a corrupted data packet. The humans had been maintaining systems according to different standards than assembly protocols required on the trade hub Epsilon. Its convergence, the transportation network collapsed when the automated scheduling system began routing cargo ships into overlapping flight paths, and only the quick reflexes of several experienced pilots prevented multiple catastrophic collisions. The Threll administrator, who'd dismissed the last human coordinator as unreliable, now found himself staring at system logs that showed thousands of manual adjustments made over 5 years to compensate for a clock synchronization drift that the Threll's own engineers had declared insignificant. Why didn't the system compensate automatically? The administrator demanded the system was designed to assume all components would operate within specified parameters. The lead engineer explained, "It never occurred to us that something operating at acceptable efficiency could still cause problems, but it occurred to the human." The administrator said quietly power fluctuations rippled across 17 worlds in the Soul and Harmony Collective, and while none were immediately catastrophic, the unpredictability caused severe distress to the empathic species who had lived with perfect stability for generations. Investigation traced the problem to emotionally resonance dampening systems that were experiencing feedback loops and threatening to amplify rather than dampen extreme emotional states, but the primary systems were still functioning perfectly, according to all diagnostics. A young Solon engineer remembered something and pulled up records from the Western facility on Harmony's Rest, where she found documentation for a backup dampening system that a human counselor named David Park had installed and maintained, in which no one had checked in 6 months, because who maintained backup systems for technology that never failed? And they finally inspected it. They found the backup system running at 40% capacity, trying desperately to compensate for harmonics in the primary system that the Solon hadn't even known existed, and without monthly maintenance, it was breaking down. The pattern emerged across the galaxy like a terrible revelation written in infrastructure failures and system breakdowns. Humanity had been holding everything together with redundancies that everyone else considered wasteful and overcautious, and now those invisible safety nets were disappearing. The Virthal High Council convened in their quantum chambers and accessed records that showed human technicians had maintained physical paper backups of critical data for 200 years. Despite being mocked for their primitive attachment to physical medium, now 3 different quantum data storage systems had experienced events, and the only intact copies of some essential information existed in warehouses full of paper documents located in human space, which was completely sealed to outside contact. "We need humanity back," one counselor stated bluntly. "Our civilization is literally falling apart. Without them, falling apart is dramatic." Another counselor objected, "We're experiencing some infrastructure difficulties, but our best minds can certainly whatever the humans were doing. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong, because understanding what humanity had been doing required understanding why they'd been doing it, and that meant understanding a philosophy that was completely alien to species who'd never experienced the disasters that had shaped human thinking. The Mechanar Collective assigned 10,000 of their finest analytical minds to study human engineering practices, and they produced a comprehensive report that concluded human methods were based on something they termed paranoid pessimism, which assumed every component would eventually fail, and every system would eventually break, and every safety measure would eventually be needed. "This is illogical," the collective's leaders declared. Why prepare extensively for unlikely scenarios when resources could be better allocated to optimizing normal operations? The response came 3 days later, when a Mechanar computational hub experienced its first critical failure in 6,000 years because a human technician had been running weekly diagnostic routines that the hub's own systems considered unnecessary, and without those diagnostics, a corrupted memory sector had propagated throughout. The network trade between systems began breaking down as shipping schedules became unreliable in communication. Delays made coordination difficult, and species that had maintained peaceful relations for centuries began arguing over missed deliveries. In broken contracts, the Galactic Assembly held an emergency session, and for the first time in living memory, the Grand Hall was filled with anger and fear rather than calm deliberation. "We must contact humanity immediately," demanded the Solon representative. "We must ask them to return. We must demand they honor their obligations," countered the Praetorian Compact's ambassador. "They abandoned their posts and left critical systems vulnerable," a human voice cut through the argument, and everyone turned in shock to see that someone had managed to transmit a message into the chamber. "Despite the communications difficulties, you didn't ask us to leave," said a woman who appeared as a holographic projection. "You were relieved when we left because you considered our methods wasteful and our concerns paranoid." The woman was identified as former Chief Delegate Sarah Chen, and she looked older and more tired than she had 6 months earlier. "We're not being vindictive," Sarah continued. "We're being cautious, as always, and right. Now we're cautious about a galactic civilization that never learned to prepare for disasters. Because we were always there preparing for them on your behalf. Will you help us?" The Virathal High Speaker asked, and there was something in the quantum resonance of the question that might have been humility that depends. Sarah replied on whether you're willing to actually learn or whether you just want us to fix everything so you can go back to ignoring us. The transmission ended, and the assembly was left with a choice that was really no choice at all, because systems were breaking down faster than they could be repaired, and the only people who understood how to fix them were watching from behind sealed borders on Earth. Sarah Chen sat in a conference room with 50 other key decision-makers, and they reviewed reports from across the galaxy with grim satisfaction that came not from spite, but from desire. "Vindication, they're ready to listen now," said Admiral Torres. "The question is whether we're ready to go back. Not yet." Sarah said firmly, "They need to understand that this isn't about us being right, them being wrong, but about fundamentally different approaches to survival, and until they actually want to learn our approach, rather than just benefit from it, we keep the borders." Sealed outside human space, the galaxy continued its slow unraveling, and species who had never known disaster began experiencing their first taste of what humanity had been protecting them from all along. 1 year after humanity's withdrawal, the Galactic HFY Assembly faced a truth that their most advanced civilizations had somehow never encountered. Complex systems fail, and the more optimized a system becomes, the more catastrophically it fails. When something goes wrong, the Mechanar Collective prided themselves on computational perfection, and their networks had operated at 99.99% efficiency for millennia, but now those same networks were experiencing cascading failures that spread like wildfire through their crystalline matrices. Chief Engineer Torvin had spent months studying human technical manuals, salvaged from abandoned stations, and what he found disturbed him deeply because it revealed a philosophy that seemed designed by beings who expected betrayal from the universe itself. Humans called it Murphy's Law. Torvin explained to his fellow Mechanar during an emergency conclave the principle that anything that can go wrong will eventually go wrong. "That's merely pessimistic thinking," objected one of the elder nodes. "Proper design prevents failures." "No," Torvin said, and his matrix flickered with something that might have been frustration. "Proper design, according to our standards, creates single points of failure because we assume components will operate within parameters, but human design assumes components will fail and builds accordingly." He pulled up a schematic of a human-designed communication relay and highlighted the redundancies. They installed 3 backup systems where we would install none, and they scheduled maintenance to replace components at 70% efficiency, where we wait until 80%, and they tested their backups monthly, even though the probability of needing them was less than 0.01% wasteful. Several nodes chimed in unison, survival-oriented. Torvin corrected, they weren't wasting resources, they were buying insurance. And now that the insurance is gone, we're learning what it was protecting us from on the Solan worlds. The empathic species struggled with a concept that contradicted their fundamental nature, because Solan society was built on emotional harmony and trust, but humans had operated on the principle of trust but verify, which the Solan found almost offensive. Counselor Lyria had been David Park's closest colleague, and she'd spent months reviewing his work, trying to understand why he'd installed backup systems that seemed to doubt the primary system's reliability. He didn't doubt the technology. She finally realized during a meditation session he doubted the universe, and I think that's the key difference between us and them. She explained her insight to the Solan High Council. We evolved on worlds where nature was gentle and balanced. So we learned to trust in natural harmony, but humans evolved on a world that actively tried to kill them through storms and earthquakes and diseases and predators. So they learned to trust nothing. One counselor observed sadly, they learned to prepare for everything. Lyria corrected, it's not paranoia when the universe has repeatedly proven it's trying to hurt you, and Earth taught humanity that lesson over and over for millions of years. That Virathal faced perhaps the most humbling revelation, because As the oldest and most advanced civilization in the assembly, they had long considered themselves the standard by which all others should be measured, but now they discovered that their quantum data storage systems had been slowly corrupting for decades, and only human paper backups had prevented catastrophic data loss. High Archivist Quenth accessed records that showed human clerks had been printing physical copies of critical documents for 2 centuries and filing them in climate-controlled warehouses. And every Virethal who'd learned of this practice had considered it charmingly primitive. They weren't being primitive. Quenth reported to the High Council they were implementing what they called defense in depth, which means having multiple independent layers of protection, so that if one fails, others can compensate, but quantum storage doesn't fail. A counselor objected. Quenth displayed corruption logs that proved otherwise. Fails rarely, but it does fail, and over long enough timelines. Rare events become certainties, and humans think in timelines that account for rare events. The pattern became clear. Across every species and every system, humanity had been quietly implementing safety measures that everyone else considered unnecessary because humans planned for scenarios that seemed impossibly unlikely to species who'd never experienced catastrophic failure, but understanding the what didn't help with the how because reverse engineering human methodology required adopting human philosophy, and that meant accepting that perfection was impossible and optimization had limits and safety margins were necessary even when they seemed wasteful. The Praetorian Compact attempted to rebuild their trade networks using human principles and failed spectacularly because they tried to implement the abundancies without understanding the reasoning, and ended up with systems that were both inefficient and unstable. You can't just copy the techniques, explained a smuggled human technical consultant who'd been hired at enormous cost. You have to change your entire mindset from how do we make this work perfectly to how do we make this survive imperfectly. Meanwhile, the political infrastructure began cracking under the strain of unreliable communications and missed shipments because the Galactic Assembly's peace had been maintained by carefully negotiated treaties and trade agreements that assumed perfect information flow and reliable. Resource Distribution Ambassador Krell of the Threll Concordat found himself in a border dispute with the Praetorian Compact. It would have been resolved in hours a year ago, but now took weeks because messages were delayed and verification was impossible, and neither side trusted the other's claims. We need human mediators. His aide suggested, the humans are gone. Krell snapped. We'll have to solve this ourselves. But solving it themselves meant falling back on older, more primitive methods of diplomacy, and Krell slowly realized that humanity had been doing more than just maintaining physical infrastructure. They'd been maintaining social infrastructure through their obsessive documentation and their backup communication channels and their contingency protocols for every possible dispute the humans had, created a safety net for galactic civilization that was so comprehensive and so subtle that no one had even realized it existed until it was gone on Earth. The human leadership watched the galactic situation deteriorate with mixed feelings because there was no satisfaction in being proven right when the cost was measured in suffering across hundreds of worlds. We could help them right now, argued General Martinez during a strategy session. We could send teams to stabilize the critical systems, and then what? Sarah Chen countered, they go back to ignoring our advice until the next crisis, and we spend another 200 years. Being the galaxy's unpaid insurance policy, people are suffering. Martinez pressed, people are learning. Sarah replied firmly, every species in the assembly lived in paradise, built on the assumption that paradise is the natural state of the universe. But Earth taught us that chaos is the natural state, and order requires constant effort. She pulled up reports from human intelligence operatives who were monitoring the situation. They're starting to understand. And some species are genuinely trying to adopt our methods, but others are angry and looking for someone to blame. The Galactic Assembly had indeed fractured into factions, with some species accepting responsibility for their over-reliance on optimization and others claiming that humanity had sabotaged systems before leaving, or had deliberately created dependencies to make themselves indispensable. Let them argue. Sarah decided when they're ready to actually learn instead of just wanting quick fixes, we'll talk. But time was running out because infrastructure failures were accelerating, and some systems were reaching cascade points where collapse would become irreversible. And the question wasn't whether humanity would intervene, but whether they could intervene fast enough. When they finally decided to act in a research station orbiting a neutron star, a mechaner scientist named Chorus made a discovery. That changed everything when she found a human engineering manual titled Designing Systems for Graceful Degradation Under Catastrophic Conditions. The manual's introduction contained a quote from an ancient human engineer. "Hope is not a strategy, and luck is not a plan, so we build systems that survive our own mistakes because we know we'll make them." Chorus transmitted the manual to every species in the assembly with a simple message: this is what we need to become. 14 months after humanity's withdrawal, the Galactic Assembly did something it had never done in its 3,000-year history. It formally apologized to a member species and begged them to return. The apology was transmitted on every available channel and broadcast toward human space with enough power to ensure it couldn't be missed, and it was signed by representatives of 293 species, who had put aside pride and politics to acknowledge a simple truth. Needed humanity, we were wrong. The message began, and those 3 words represented a revolution in galactic thinking. We dismissed your caution as paranoia and your redundancies as waste, and we failed to understand that your methods were born from hard experience rather than irrational fear. The message continued with offers that would have been unthinkable a year earlier: permanent seats on the High Council for Humanity with veto power over infrastructure decisions and formal legal protections for human
nearing
practices and generous financial compensation for 2 centuries of undervalued service. Please come back. The message concluded, "We are dying without you." The response from humanity came 3 days later, and it was not what the assembly expected. No. Sarah Chen said simply, and her holographic image appeared in the grand hall where silence fell like a heavy blanket. "You're refusing?" The Virathal High Speaker asked with disbelief resonating through its quantum matrix. "We're refusing to return to the old arrangement," Sarah clarified, because going back would just perpetuate the same problems that led to this crisis. She stood before the assembled species with the weight of human history behind her words. "It nearly destroyed itself 6 times before we reached the stars, and each time we learned lessons written in blood and ash and radiation. We learned that complex systems fail catastrophically when pushed to their limits during our climate collapse." Sarah continued, "We learned that peace requires constant maintenance during our world wars, and we learned that optimization without safety margins leads to disaster during our economic crashes. You never learned these lessons," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, just statement of fact. "You never had to, because your worlds were gentle, and your evolution was peaceful, and your civilizations developed without the constant threat of self-annihilation." A Solon counselor spoke up with emotional distress coloring her projection. "So you'll let us suffer to teach us a lesson?" "No," Sarah replied. "We'll help you learn the lesson so you don't have to suffer through what we did, but that requires you to actually change, not just temporarily adopt our methods until the crisis passes." She outlined humanity's conditions, and they were far more demanding than the Assembly's offers first. Every species had to establish educational programs teaching human risk management and disaster preparedness, and these programs had to be mandatory for all engineers and administrators. Second, all critical infrastructure had to be redesigned with human-approved redundancy levels and safety margins, even if it meant accepting lower efficiency. Third, the Assembly had to establish a permanent crisis prevention council with human leadership and full authority to override efficiency optimizations that threatened system stability. Fourth, humans would provide technical assistance and training, but Assembly species had to do the actual work of rebuilding because learning required doing. "Not just watching. These demands are excessive," protested the Praetorian Compact's ambassador. "You're asking us to fundamentally restructure our entire civilization." "Yes." Sarah agreed, "because your entire civilization is fundamentally vulnerable to disruption, and always has been, but you never noticed because we were catching you when you fell." The Assembly dissolved into argument, with some species accepting humanity's terms immediately and others refusing on grounds of pride or sovereignty or simple inability to comprehend why. Such drastic changes were necessary. The Mechanor Collective was among the first to accept because Torvin had convinced his fellows that their perfect computational systems were actually perfectly fragile. We optimize for performance in ideal conditions. Torvin explained to his people, but the universe doesn't provide ideal conditions in humans. Optimized for survival in terrible conditions, which is why their systems still work. The Solon accepted next, though it pained their empathic nature. To acknowledge they'd been wrong, we must learn to trust but verify. Counselor Lyria told her people. Even if verification feels like doubt because doubt keeps us safer than blind faith, but the Praetorian Compact refused, along with the Threll Concordat, and 17 other species who insisted they could rebuild. On their own, using their traditional methods enhanced with superficial human techniques, you'll fail. Sarah told them bluntly during a tense diplomatic exchange. You can't cherry-pick the methods without adopting the mindset we'll see. The Praetorian ambassador replied coldly, the Galactic Assembly fractured along ideological lines with what humans termed the Adaptation Coalition, accepting human philosophy and beginning the difficult work of cultural transformation, while the Sovereignty Bloc attempted to maintain their traditional approaches. Humanity began sending technical teams to Adaptation Coalition worlds, but the help came with strict conditions. Human engineers had full authority over safety decisions, and local species had to participate in all maintenance and repairs and any attempt to override human safety protocols would result in immediate withdrawal of support in the Mechanor homeworld. Human engineer Patricia Okonkwo supervised the installation of new backup systems in a critical computation hub, while Mechanor technicians watched and learned why 3 independent backup power supplies. One Mechanor asked probability analysis suggests 2 would provide adequate redundancy. Because Murphy's Law says if 2 can fail, then eventually both will fail at the same time. Patricia explained 3 gives you a backup for your backup, and yes. I know it seems wasteful, but I've seen too many impossible coincidences to trust probability alone. The Mechanor struggled with this logic that contradicted their computational precision, but they were learning. Meanwhile, the Sovereignty Bloc discovered that superficial adoption of human techniques without underlying philosophy produced systems that were somehow worse than what they'd had before because they got the inefficiency. Without the resilience, the Praetorian Compact's new trade network incorporated redundant routing and backup communication channels, but when a major hub failed, the redundancies didn't activate properly because no one had tested them, and when asked why not, the Praetorian engineers explained that testing backups seemed wasteful when they probably wouldn't. B needed 3 Praetorian merchant ships collided in the resulting chaos, and the death toll reached 200 before emergency services could respond. Perhaps we should reconsider the human offer, suggested a junior Praetorian official during the disaster review. Absolutely not. The senior leadership declared this was merely a temporary setback. But setbacks continued and accumulated, and the gap between the adaptation coalitions improving. Stability in the Sovereignty Bloc's ongoing deterioration became impossible to ignore. Earth Sarah Chen received daily reports on both groups, and she felt no satisfaction in watching the Sovereignty Bloc struggle because every preventable disaster was a tragedy regardless of politics. How long do we let them fail before we intervene? Admiral Torres asked, until they ask for help properly. Sarah replied, not with pride or demands, but with genuine willingness to learn. Some species never asked, and their civilizations collapsed into isolated fragments that would take centuries to rebuild. But others eventually swallowed their pride and sent ambassadors to request admission to the Adaptation Coalition. Species that joined had to acknowledge publicly that their previous approach had been flawed and commit to genuine cultural change, and these public acknowledgments were painful but necessary. The galaxy was transforming, but not into what it had been before, because the old assembly had been built on the assumption of perpetual stability, while the new coalition was being built on the assumption of inevitable chaos. And humanity stood at the center, not as saviors or conquerors, but as teachers, sharing lessons learned from 10,000 years of disaster and survival, because that was the most human thing of all, taking the terrible knowledge bought with suffering and using it to prevent others from paying the same price. 5 years after humanity's withdrawal, the galaxy had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the beings who'd inhabited it before, and the transformation had been painful and costly, but those who survived emerged stronger. Adaptation Coalition now encompassed 247 species who had committed to what they called the human philosophy, though humans themselves insisted it should be called the survival philosophy, because there was nothing uniquely human about preparing for disaster, except that humans had learned it first on the Mechanar homeworld chief engineer. Torvin supervised a network that ran at 87% of its pre-crisis efficiency, but had already survived 3 critical component failures that would have caused catastrophic collapse under the old system. We could optimize this to 92%. A young Mechanar engineer suggested eagerly we could. Torvin agreed, but that would require reducing our backup capacity from triple redundancy to double redundancy, and I've learned to trust human wisdom on this. 2 is 1, and 1 is none. The young engineer's crystalline matrix flickered with confusion. I don't understand that saying, it means that too. Backup systems should be treated as equivalent to 1 because eventually both will fail simultaneously, and one backup system should be treated as equivalent to none because it will fail when you need it most. Torvin explained its pessimistic thinking, but pessimism keeps systems running. Across Mechanar space, the species that had once prided itself on computational perfection now ran mandatory courses on disaster preparedness and failure analysis. And young Mechanar grew up learning to ask not how can we make this work perfectly, but how can we make this survive imperfectly. The Solon had undergone perhaps the most profound cultural shift because their empathic nature had made them vulnerable to cascading emotional feedback that humans had been quietly dampening for 2 centuries. Counselor Lyria now led the Solon Council of Preparedness, which was a governmental body that would have seemed paranoid and negative to her people 5 years earlier, but which they now understood as essential. We've installed backup dampening systems in every population center, she reported during a council session. We've trained emergency response teams to handle empathic cascade events have we needed them, asked a counselor who still struggled with the idea of preparing for disasters that might never occur twice. Lyria replied both times the primary dampening systems experienced partial failures that would have led to severe emotional trauma for millions, but the backups engaged automatically in most. Solon never even noticed. She smiled in a way that showed both sadness and acceptance. David Park would be proud of us. The Virethal had discovered that their quantum data storage was far less permanent than they'd believed, and had established vast physical archives that duplicated digital records in formats that could survive electromagnetic pulses and quantum decoherence events and civilizational collapse high. Archivist Quenth oversaw warehouses full of crystalline tablets and printed documents and even old-fashioned magnetic tape, because humans had taught them that data storage diversity was as important as data storage redundancy. Future generations may mock us for our primitive backup methods, Quenth observed to a visiting human archivist, just as we once mocked you. And when those future generations experience their first major data corruption event, they'll be very grateful for your primitive paranoia. The human replied with a knowing smile, but not every species had adapted successfully, and the sovereignty bloc had fragmented into isolated civilizations, struggling to maintain basic infrastructure, with some barely qualifying as spacefaring anymore. The Praetorian Compact had lost 30% of its territory to independence movements when the central government couldn't maintain reliable communication with distant colonies, and the Compact's leadership still refused to acknowledge that their approach had been fundamentally flawed. They'll learn eventually, Sarah Chen observed during a briefing on galactic affairs. Or they won't. And either way, we've done what we can. Humanity had reopened its borders, but on carefully controlled terms, because 5 years of watching the galaxy struggle had reinforced the wisdom of caution and verification. Human engineers now worked on infrastructure projects across coalition space, but always in supervisory roles, with strict authority over safety decisions and local species doing the actual implementation. Webb had returned to Hyperspace Relay Station Gamma 7, trained a new generation of Mechanar engineers, who actually listened when he explained why components should be replaced before they reached critical efficiency thresholds. It still feels wasteful, admitted one of his students. Discarding parts that still function, you're not discarding them. Marcus corrected, you're preventing them from failing at the worst possible moment, and there's nothing wasteful about avoiding disasters. On Concordia Station, which had been partially rebuilt, the Galactic Assembly convened in a hall that was smaller and less grand than before, but which now included permanent seats for human representatives with full voting rights and veto authority over decisions. Sarah Chen occupied one of those seats, and she watched with satisfaction as the Assembly debated new infrastructure standards that incorporated human redundancy requirements. Some call this the human empire. A Virathal counselor observed during a private conversation with Sarah, "May say you've conquered the galaxy through enforced dependency." Sarah shook her head. "We haven't conquered anything, and the dependency isn't enforced, it's a natural result of the fact that we're the only species who spent our entire evolution learning to survive despite the universe's active hostility. Will that always be true?" the Virathal asked. "Or can we eventually develop the same instincts?" "Already developing them," Sarah replied. "Your children grow up running disaster drills and learning about failure modes and thinking about backup plans, and in a few generations, you'll have internalized the philosophy enough that you won't need us watching over your shoulder, but you'll stay anyway," the Virathal observed, "until we're genuinely not needed anymore." Sarah confirmed, because leaving too soon is what got us into this mess in the first place. On a small agricultural world, a young mixed-species school held a class where Mechanar and Solon and Threll children learned alongside human children about something called Murphy's Law, and they laughed at the pessimistic humans, saying that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But then, their teacher, a retired human engineer named Patricia Conquo, showed them recordings of the infrastructure collapse 5 years earlier, and the laughter stopped. "My world nearly died because we didn't believe in Murphy's Law," a young Solon said quietly. "My parents almost lost their home when the power grid failed. Mine did lose theirs." A Mechanor child added, "They had to relocate to a shelter for 6 months." Patricia nodded with understanding in her eyes. "Why you're learning this now, so that when you grow up and become engineers or administrators or leaders, you'll remember that optimism is wonderful, but preparation is essential." A human child raised her hand. "Why didn't the other species know this already? Earth taught us when we were really young. Earth taught humanity through disasters," Patricia explained. "Your species learned the hard way over thousands of years, but these children get to learn the easy way through education. That's a gift worth more than you realize." The class continued, and across the galaxy millions of similar lessons were being taught in thousands of schools, as an entire civilization slowly internalized the philosophy that allowed humanity to survive its own worst impulses. Admiral Torres retired from military service and wrote a book titled The Price of Perfection, which became required reading in Adaptation Coalition universities, and in it he detailed how humanity's scars from world wars and nuclear standoffs and climate disasters had created a culture of cautious, seemed paranoid to those who'd never faced extinction. "We prepared for the worst because we'd lived through it," Torres wrote in his conclusion. "Other species prepared for the best because they'd never known anything else, and the galaxy nearly collapsed because comfort creates complacency." Sarah Chen eventually stepped down from her position on the Assembly Council, but not before seeing the fruition of humanity's influence. When the Assembly formally adopted the Continuity Accords, which required all member species to maintain infrastructure, redundancy levels and safety margins, and disaster preparedness, programs that met human-approved standards on her last day, she stood in the rebuilt Grand Hall, and a young Mechanor engineer approached her with what might have been nervousness in its crystalline flickering. "I wanted to thank you," the engineer said. "I know humans are tired of being thanked, but I need to say it anyway." "What for, specifically?" Sarah asked. "For being paranoid enough to save us from ourselves," the engineer replied. "We thought we'd built paradise, but we'd really just built a beautiful, fragile thing that couldn't survive contact with reality. You showed us how to build something that could actually last." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth. "You're welcome, and make sure the next generation understands that this isn't about human superiority or special wisdom. It's just about learning from mistakes, and we made a lot of mistakes before we figured this out."